my distinct pleasure then to introduce our first speaker, Genevieve Bell, who's going to start walking out slowly and come up to the podium as I'm talking, who is the Director of User Experience Research at Intel. She is an anthropologist by trade and study and interest, right?
Predisposition.
A predisposition, and has an incredible, wonderful accent, is going to show you all sorts of amazing things. Thank you so much, Genevieve, for coming and being with us.
Oh, you're very welcome, and what a pleasure to be here. I know, how often is it that you get to follow someone whereasing quite like that? That was extraordinary. Zach, if you're really kind to me, you're going to put my slides up on this screen right here. Or not. Anyway, my name is Genevieve Bell. I'm incredibly pleased to be here. And one of the things I wanted to do today was actually reflect on my job at Intel, where I am, as was so graciously introduced, an anthropologist, but I realize I'm also an anthropologist, unlike, if there are any of you in the audience, most of you. Oh, look, technical help. I will stand really still while we have technical assistance. Whereas, in previous existences, I'd like to tell you about the future. Oh, sweetie, you're doing so well. Oh, yay! I know. Now, I don't suppose there are any Australians in the room, are there? Oh, there's at least one, in which case, sir, you will recognize this as a Kingswood. For those of you who aren't Australians, you don't know this is not a Ford vehicle, and I apologize to the nice people from Ford as I'm showing a picture of its competitor in Australia, completely, as it turns out, by accident. What I wanted to do was talk a little bit about the future and talk about one of the ways I think we can get to the future by actually looking at the past. I realize it's kind of cheeky to come and talk about cars in a week where Washington, D.C. has just upped its ongoing remarkable contribution to a bicycle-led revolution. But I thought, I know, yay! But I thought I would nonetheless talk about cars and why it is that I think cars are a really interesting form of technology and tell us as much about our futures as they tell us about our past. I realize I should also begin, however, by a slightly more protracted introduction of myself. I be the legs poking out from underneath this vehicle. It turns out, in addition to being an anthropologist, I'm also Australian, and long before I came to Intel, I worked both as an academic anthropologist and then as an anthropologist in my home country. I'm also lucky enough to be the child of an anthropologist, and I grew up on my mother's field sites in Central and Northern Australia in the 1970s and 1980s. That means I know how to get water out of frogs. It's not good for the frogs. I also know how to tell the difference between a snake hole and a lizard hole and which one I should put my hand down for dinner. Turns out the answer is the lizard hole, perhaps unsurprisingly. I've been at Intel for 13 years. When I joined Intel, my new boss sat me down on my first day of the job and said, "We need your help with two things." I said, "Excellent, I love that kind of clarity. What would those be?" She said, "We need your help with women." And I remember looking around the company and thinking, that is correct. But I was also freshly minted from the university system, so I knew there was a better question I should ask, which was, which women? And my boss of the day said, all women. And I said, all 3 billion? And she said, yes. And I said, exactly what is it you want me to tell you about 3 billion women? She said, well, if you could tell us what they want, that would be excellent. And I think I sat there for quite some time thinking to myself, what is a project that would explain 3 billion women to a silicon company? And I was on that track for quite some time until I realized sitting on my piece of paper was the number 2. And I said to my boss, somewhat frightened, what's the second thing you need my help with? And I think at the time I hoped she'd say men, because that would round out the equation. But instead she said ROW. And I realized I didn't know what that was either. So I said, I'm sorry, what's ROW? And she said, that's rest of world. And I took a very deep breath and said, so just for clarity, what's world in this sentence? She said, oh, that would be America. And I said, okay. So to recap, because I'd learned that recapping was good in these conversations. So to recap, you'd like my help with women and everyone else? And she said yes. And I thought to myself, yay! This may be the best job I've ever had. And 13 years later, I realized that's still true. So my job at Intel has always been to bring stories of real people back into the company, to help shape the technology we build, to shape the platforms and services we architect, and generally to keep us a little bit more honest about what it is that we're doing. And I thought I was making real progress until quite recently one of my colleagues said to me, we've listened, we've heard, and we've found the people that we're designing for. And I paused for a very long time, and then I said, who have you found? And they're like, well, we've found our users. And I probably wasn't very helpful at this point because I think I looked at my colleagues and said, I'm sorry, where do you think you're going to find 3 generations of white people happily sitting on the same sofa watching the same content? I suspect even more unhelpfully, I suggested they'd found Canada. Which is good, but isn't a very big market. I had some other questions about this too, like why was the furniture white? For those of us with children know you don't have white furniture and small children. Any one of us who actually lives in the real world does not have a living room this uncluttered. And as one of the engineers pointed out to me as I went on this deconstructive rant, in what world does she get the remote control? Exactly. And I remember thinking, oh, you've found people, but they're all the wrong people. Now, of course, if you're a designer, this is a deeply seductive image because it suggests there are people sitting around happily in an almost blank environment waiting for you to bring them something almost guaranteed they'll be delighted. Now, the reality for most of us, those of us who think about innovation, those of us who drive new technology design, those of us who use new technology know that the reality is infinitely more complicated and arguably messy. And often it looks more like this. And so we came back to my engineers and said, listen, we think finding the real people is a really good idea, but we think they look more like this and less like that. You know, this is what the reality of what we design for looks like. It's somebody in an apartment with more technology than you can poke a stick at, where all of that technology is competing for a single electrical outlet, where you have to make decisions about do you run the fax and photocopying machine or the automatic foot massage machine, where you have a VCR and a DVD and a cable box and enough content on DVD you never need to leave this apartment again, where there are 7 remote controls and a tangle of wires. And the reality is no matter what we make, no matter what we build, no matter what platforms we develop, they're always going to exist in worlds where people already have things they care about, where they're already doing things that are important to them, and where the challenge for all of us when we think about what it means to be genuinely innovative is to make something so delightful that it finds room on this coffee table. Or something so delightful that you want to unplug something that's already plugged in this room to replace it with the thing that you're making. And for me, that's a fairly high bar, but it's a bar I'm really excited that we get to think about. So as I was wondering about the sort of the theme of this conference for today about mobility and technology, I was struck by the fact that many of us in this room know many stories about mobility and know many stories about mobile futures. I'm willing to bet for a number of us we've sat in airports and train stations and bus stations that look remarkably like this, where everyone has a mobile device in their hand, where everyone's in their own world. Many of us know the statistics. Billions and billions of smartphones, billions of connected devices, more billions of texts, of location-based services, of hits on various websites. And I was thinking, what is it that one could possibly say that was new here or that was interesting? And I realized one of the things one could do was maybe take on a different kind of mobile technology. And I was really struck in thinking about cars. Now, why cars, you might say, when all of us know that we want to move to a world that has less of them? The reality is that cars, much like other things, I would argue, television and paper in particular, cars are stubborn artifacts. They're not going to go away half as quickly as some of us may wish they would. There are more than 800,000 cars on the world's roads today. The fastest growing car markets in the world are places like China, across all of Latin America. The age of the average fleet on the road is about 5 years. Somewhere around 60 million new cars will be built this year. So as many bicycles as there are in DC, there will be cars on the rest of the world, which makes them really interesting. These are objects that configure our daily lives. The average commute time globally in the last year is up 6% year on year. In America, it turns out that we spend a stunning amount of time in our cars commuting. About 84% of Americans commute on a daily basis. When you ask people what's the most stressful part of their working life, they don't actually say it has anything to do with their time in the office. They say it has to do with their commute. When we look globally, it turns out in emerging markets, cars are one of the fastest growing status symbols and acquisition objects. So as we may be scaling back, other markets are ramping up significantly. By the end of this year, China will be the 3rd biggest car market in the world. It's likely to become the biggest car market within the next 3 to 5 years. Cars are everywhere. It also turns out they're full of technology. I know my colleagues here from Ford can talk about it. Apparently there is a Ford outside you can look at. It is full of technology too. It turns out that when you take apart any one of these cars, perhaps not this wee darling here, but most of the rest of them, they are full of technology. All manner of technology. And that got me to thinking, what do we know about cars as social scientists? Turns out precious little. We know a great deal about them as objects. We know a great deal about them as markers of social status, of progress, of modernity. It turns out we know precious little about what people do in and around them. And so I set my team and I the challenge of working out what do people do with their cars. And we thought for a long time, because I'm an anthropologist, so mostly my research method is to go hang out with people. It's a little hard to think about how you hang out with people in their cars. Do you want to commute with them? An interesting project, and we did a bit of that. Do you want to drive with people? Do you want to sit in the garage waiting for people to come backwards and forwards to their cars? That seemed like a non-winning proposition. And then one of my colleagues and I were sitting around and thinking about all the research methods we knew, and we realized that both she and I had done archaeology at school. And we said, ooh, 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 ooh. Postmodernism hit archaeology about 10 years ago and started to create a very different set of discourses in archaeology about what it is that the object of archaeological inquiry might be and about how those methods might work, and became as preoccupied with the material that one effectively excavates as how that material came to be where it was. So thinking about things like traces and flows. And so my colleague and I sat there in a very grey, very dull conference room in Oregon in the middle of winter and said to ourselves, where on the planet could we go to empty a car, and what might it tell us if we could? And so we set out around the world to empty people's cars. We went to Australia, we went to Malaysia, Singapore, the UK, Los Angeles, good car culture, a few other places around the planet, and basically said to people, hi, we'd like to see what's in your car. No, really, everything. No, no, really, everything. No, really, yes, what's in your glove compartment? Yep, what's under the seats? What's in the side pockets of the door? What's behind the seats? What's in the back seat? And yes, what's even in the boot/trunk? We want to see all of it. And not only do we want to see all of it, but we're really excited if you take it all out, put it on the ground, let us photograph it. And astonishingly, people let us do all of that. And so what I want to do is tell you a little bit about what we found and why I think it is both provocative and interesting as a way of thinking about new mobile technologies. Yes, this will be the contents of a car in Australia. Before you think to yourself, this man is a serial killer, which is easy to conclude, you should know he is in fact a volunteer firefighter, which is why he has all that gear in the back end of this photo that suggests that he's not the kind of person you want to meet in a dark alley late at night. What was really clear from this vehicle, however, and many other vehicles we unpacked, is that one of the things that cars do is facilitate a multitude of different lives. For this particular individual, this car lets him be a volunteer firefighter. He has all of his kit in it. In Australia, if you live in rural communities, as he does, fires are deadly and you need to be able to go directly to it. So he carries all of his gear, which includes a chainsaw, a fairly large axe, bolt cutters, and in the foreground here, where you can't quite see it, as it turns out, a flame-retardant prosthetic limb. This particular firefighter only has one leg, and the fire station mandates that he carries a spare flame-retardant leg with him on all occasions, which makes the contents of this car genuinely remarkable. In addition to all of his firefighting gear, there's also the gear he takes when he goes fishing. There's all the stuff his wife uses when she takes the recycling out, and this car has become, in many ways, a staging point for a myriad of different lives. I want to pause here and ask you the question, what else are you staging out of all the mobile devices in your hands right now that in some ways looks remarkably like this? What are the things in your phone, in your iPad, in your laptop that you use to facilitate a range of different lives? Because I bet the answer is there's some stuff. Possibly not a flame-retardant prosthetic limb, but you all need to live better. Turns out, I think you can also make the argument that cars are third places. I'm not sure Ray Oldenburg would thank me for this observation, but one of the things I was deeply struck by as we started to unpack cars was that these weren't functioning like mobile offices or mobile living rooms, but they were functioning like a place in between other places. So it was somewhere where, in this particular instance in Singapore, this young woman had all of the gear she needed in order to make sales calls. So that this was not necessarily her mobile office, but it was the place she staged her office from. In lots of other vehicles, we turned out there were things like golf clubs and shoes, all manner of sporting equipment. This notion that, in fact, one of the things that cars let you do was find time in between places to do things. It was also the case in all of the stories we collected when we asked people about their relationships with their cars. Because it turns out once you've unpacked the contents of someone's car, you can have a completely different conversation with them about what they really do there. Because before that, people tell you, I just go from, home to the office and occasionally to the shops. And then you start to unpack people's cars and you're like, excuse me, what's this for then? Oh, well, there's this whole other thing I do. What also became clear as people started telling us these stories was that cars are also a place that people go to be by themselves. So that cars function as a place where you get time to yourself, where you get time away from other things. They also function as places where we have heightened social activity. The notion of the persistence of long road trips, of a place where you debrief with your spouse or you set the sort of framework for your kids about what they're doing were all kind of critically important here. It's also the case that cars keep us socially safe. This is a really interesting concept for us. We thought about physical safety, but we realized that social safety was at work too. This is the contents of a car in Singapore, and although you can't quite see it, in the upper right-hand corner there's a tantalizing glimpse of gold and orange. These are ang pao, or envelopes that you give in traditional Chinese circumstances for Chinese New Year, but also at all sorts of other ritual occasions, mostly at weddings and sometimes at the visiting of friends and at children's births. Every car we unpacked in Singapore had ang pao in the glove compartment. This car had Volvo branded ang pao that came in a leather case from Volvo when the car was newly purchased. This is not something we had found up until now, and I remember saying to this particular individual, why do you have ang pao in your glove compartment? These red envelopes. And he said, well, for emergency weddings. And I said, okay, I thought I understood about weddings in your culture. I didn't think you had emergency weddings. What does that mean? He's like, well, when the wedding's an emergency. I'm like, okay, is this like a shotgun wedding, an elopement? What is this? He's like, no. It's when you turn up at a wedding and you don't have the right gift. I'm like, ah. And the emergency is about supplementing your gift to make it the right gift. It's about what happens when you're invited somewhere, when you have to go somewhere and you have to produce something and you don't have it. What every resident, nearly every resident that we encountered in Singapore, and certainly the Malaysians that we encountered who were of Chinese descent in Malaysia, all had ang pao in their glove compartments. When we pushed on it, it was all about keeping people socially safe. Now, I would argue we've certainly turned out cars in Western countries where people had greeting cards, scotch tape, scissors and ribbon in their glove compartments. In Australia, when we went back and looked at it, we realized that everyone had alcohol in the boots of their car, and I had mistakenly assumed I knew what that was about. It turns out Australians don't like to turn up at events empty-handed, so they are staging it out of the back of their vehicles. Again, I want to pause here and say, think about the mobile devices you have in your hands and think about what's in them that keep you socially safe. Think about the applications and services you subscribe to that remind you about weddings and birthdays and anniversaries and the names of people's kids and show you photos of your nieces and nephews so you can reasonably say to your sister-in-law, yes, she looked lovely in that dress. It's all about forms of social safety. Cars also have ghosts. They have things left in them from people who have traveled in them before and haven't been removed for all kinds of reasons. Sometimes you think they're coming back, sometimes they don't intend to, but cars carry the drifting legacies of other people that we've encountered. And I want to argue so too to all the mobile devices we carry. And as my shout out to my new colleague in the back room here, cars also hold our secrets. Every car we unpacked had someone's secret stash of something. This has a secret stash underneath the Farmers Union iced coffee that if you were from South Australia you would know is the only iced coffee to drink. Underneath the Farmers Union iced coffee there is an entire wad of sticks from ice cream. The owner of this car gets into this car, she buys an ice cream, she drives for 100 kilometers and eats her ice cream when no one knows about it. Turns out she was not alone. Many people had remarkable things they did in cars that no one else knew about, most of them about this innocent. But this notion that cars is something where we keep our secrets, whether it's the place we go to cry, because we don't want to cry in the office, whether it's the place we make the phone calls we wouldn't make somewhere else. Cars, it turned out, are all about secrets, and so I would argue is every other mobile device we have. So what are cars telling us about the future of mobile technologies then? What might we learn if we start to think about how we could excavate things? Now, I thought about how you might excavate a phone. It's a little tricky. There are some great photos online of people dismantling phones into their component pieces. I realized that wasn't quite it. There's not really a moral equivalent moment of being able to turn a phone over and shake out the contents onto a shower curtain and photograph it. You can take a screen grab of the screen, you can list the apps, but it's not quite the same thing. And so I started to wonder what you might be able to get if you thought about mobile technologies this way. What would the moral equivalent of an excavation be? And what would it be to think about all of our mobile technologies this way, to think about them as having ghosts and secrets, as providing forms of social safety, of being third places? What might all of that let us think differently about the devices we carry around with us every day? All lessons, in fact, in some way, ironically, learned from the device that carries us around every day. And thinking here about the play on phones and other mobile technologies was, for me, if nothing else, at least a provocation, and I hope for you too, a different way of thinking about what people are doing with mobile technologies and how else we might talk about the future of them. But because I'm an anthropologist, I needed to end with one more story. I've done fieldwork in Southeast Asia now for over 12 years, and I'm always struck by a particular variety of stores I run into. These are stores that stock something called funerary goods, or ghost money, or spirit money. In the traditional Chinese culture, there's a festival once a year called Qingming, where you buy paper goods like this and burn them for your ancestors. The fire transforms them into real goods in the world that your ancestors live. This is a form of filial piety, it's a form of care, it's a form of taking care of your relatives. In every one of these stores I've visited in the last 10 years, you can read what it is that's socially significant by what's for sale in these stores, i.e. what you need to buy to be a good child to take care of your relatives. This last year I found this. It's a Mercedes. It had a driver. It was designed to be purchased and burnt so that your relatives would have a new car to drive around in. And it harkens back to the fact that in the 1920s and 1930s, Shanghai and other big Chinese cities were famous for producing paper versions of real cars. There was a man in Shanghai whose verisimilitude when it came to Bentleys and Rolls Royces was apparently second to none. Of course, what this also says, both in its traditional and its contemporary form, is that cars are stubborn. These are objects that we can't live without, whether we like to imagine we can or not. They're not going anywhere, and it turns out they're not going anywhere when we're dead either. And so with that, I wanted to say thank you.